As a genre, literary fiction is often defined by what it is not, and what it is not is genre fiction. Genre fiction uses speech marks, literary fiction does not. Back in February, I made a video about why men aren't writing literary fiction anymore. Spoiler alert, they are, and I got a lot of upset comments. Some of these comments were what you would expect, but others just seemed confused about what literary fiction actually is. Some of them referred to different genres entirely. Is fantasy, horror, and science fiction not literary fiction? And some to different mediums altogether. They're writing video game stories, and those are literary fiction. Some mediums of literary fiction are generally 50-50, such as comics. Let's be real, a lot of us are into lit RPG now, which I'm not actually sure is a large share of the market, but also none of those things are novels and therefore not a genre of literary fiction. And some just wanted to shit on women, accusing us of using reading only for sexual gratification. What's really going on is that women use books as a substitute for porn. What I see as a man who likes fiction at a store is about 90% women's erotica disguised as fantasy. I wonder if publishers are simply funding what sells more. He was talking about a different genre entirely, fantasy, and being dismissive of women's reading taste, because you'd be hard-pressed to get off to most literary fiction. Although, of course, publishers do fund what sells more, they are businesses, after all. When did literary fiction become a genre? Isn't all fiction literary? Well, it was in the 1980s. I'm taking this one as a genuine question, and this confusion is why I decided to make this video. But safe to say, in answer to the second question, no, not all fiction is literary fiction. I did think going into this that it was going to be a fairly short video because I know what literary fiction is, and yet, on doing more research, it became apparent that it is more complex than I had originally assumed. And I discovered that there actually is something that literary fiction has in common with porn, and that's that most of the definitions boil down to you'll know it when you see it. The complexity mostly boils down to that literary fiction does not have the same clear guidelines of other forms of fiction, although even that is an oversimplification of most genre fiction. And so the argument must always be made about where we draw the lines. Much of the defining, as I said at the beginning, comes from defining it against what it is not. And as this is mostly genre fiction, it can come across as a form of genre snobbery, and sometimes it actually is just snobbery. Some of the critics, whilst claiming to respect genre fiction, belittle it so thoroughly. And so, of course, the genre fiction practitioners who respond can be a little bit defensive. And some even go so far as to deny the existence of literary fiction as a genre at all, or to say that it no longer exists at the very least, describing it just as a way for publishers to sell books to pretentious people. So if you clicked on this video hoping to find out what literary fiction actually is, I'm going to do a stab now at defining it for you. It does have many basic definitions. As I said, some people define it as anything that doesn't fit into genre fiction. But I don't think this is true. There are many books that are set in contemporary times that deal with relationships between people but are not focused on romance, and that deal with themes such as identity, belonging, etc., but do not fall into the category of literary fiction. They just don't fall into genre fiction either. Sometimes these are called contemporary fiction or chick lit, for example, if they are written by a woman. And so the anything that's not genre fiction has to be literary fiction thing, I think falls down. The other thing that people often say, which is an opposition one, is that genre fiction is plot-driven, whereas literary fiction is character-driven. And again, there are some issues with this. I have had read books that are classified as literary fiction, where the characters don't really matter at all. They are more books of ideas and thoughts than they are books of character. These are not people that you get to know. However, I do like what Daniel Jose Older said in an interview for Lit Hub podcast. I always think about, they put up the series of 2 albums that were Duke Ellington albums, and one of them was called Piano in the Forefront, and one of them was called Piano in the Background, right? And that's how I think about some of these terms. It's like, if the plot is foregrounded, if most of the time we see them, they're on their mission and they're trying to solve the crime or get the bad guy or do what they have to do, that's going to feel rhythmically like a genre novel. Now, if we're seeing them more in their everyday lives, going through that particular drudgery, having ennui, whatever it may be, that's going to feel more literary. So I do like how he described there what plot-driven versus character-driven means. But I don't think it captures everything. There is also an argument that genre fiction is more conventional, whereas literary fiction is more experimental. However, there are books that are literary fiction, as I will come on to, that do not feel particularly experimental at all, and instead are following the formula. It's just a literary fiction formula. And so I think that this definition can have a touch of that snobbery. And this one even more so. The literary label is applied to novels considered so linguistically beautiful, intellectual, and meaningful, it has to be separated from popular fiction. Well, is that true? Is every literary fiction book you've ever read linguistically beautiful, intellectual, and meaningful? Perhaps it is better to say that that is what it is striving for than that that is what it is. It is striving for linguistic beauty. It has a focus on the way that it is written, on the form and the style, in a way that a genre fiction, whilst it may be more beautiful than most literary fiction, that is not the point or the purpose of the book. What Lincoln Michel says is the best you can do is say that most literary fiction centres style and form in the way that crime fiction centres crime and romance centres romance. So I'm not sure that any of those definitions have made it clear that literary fiction is a genre in and of itself. But all genres have a history, a place from where they began and something to which they refer. In fact, Daniel Jose Older talks about a genre as being the works to which it is referring, the intertextuality, the conversation that a book is a part of. And I found that to be really interesting. The references and the purpose of the conversation which writers of literary fiction are joining is different than the one that writers of science fiction are joining, or fantasy, or crime, or whatever it is. There are still expectations and conceits of the genre because the genre is responding to the history in which it is writing. And the history of literary fiction begins with modernism. Modernism was a movement throughout different forms of art in the early and middle part of the 20th century. And just as 20th century composers decided to eschew melody as unnecessary, 20th century fiction writers began to eschew the idea of plot. Much of modernism began after World War I, and it was the violent corruption of that time period, the way that it drove a fissure through the understanding of the world, that meant modernist writers wanted to turn away from the easy storytelling of the Victorian novel. Lev Grossman says, "The novel was a mirror the modernists needed to break, the better to reflect their own broken world." So they did. One of the things they broke was plot. To the modernists, stories were a distortion of real life. In real life, stories don't tie up neatly, events don't line up in a tidy sequence and mean the same things to everybody they happen to. Ask a veteran of the Somme whether his tour of duty resembled the boy's own war stories he grew up on. The modernists broke the clear straight lines of causality and perception and chronological sequence to make them look more like life as it's actually lived. And this is the history with which our modern literary fiction writers are contending, trying to shape the form of the novel in order to reflect the thoughts and themes of the book that they are writing. The form and the sentences, the structure of the book is just as important as the plot, the story being told, because it is the only way, or a way, which they are trying to convey the thoughts and feelings with which they are tackling. You can see this in that a lot of people find the books to be unsatisfactory, or to be boring, or to be unexpected in a way that feels like a letdown, to be off-key in some way. I think this is a reflection of that modernist past. Stories in other genres may follow a formula in which your romance ends with a happily ever after, or your mystery ends with it being solved and a reversion to the mean. Even mystery stories that have a more literary bent, such as, for example, Into the Woods by Tana French, still end up with a reversion to the mean at the end. We know whodunit, and a whodunit that doesn't answer that question is leaning more into the literary end of things. Arthur Crystal describes it thus: "Far from delivering easy pleasures, modernist fiction could be an exercise in aesthetic and psychological subtlety. It was written not for people with time on their hands, but for those willing to put in the time to master it. Indeed, fiction in the age of modernism became as much identified with literature as poetry or plays, and its complexities required a new class of expert readers, a secular clergy capable of explaining its mysteries." As well as having a history, as I have described, literary fiction also has a clear ecosystem. This means that it is clearly something in the world. Alongside marketing, the way that a Fitzcarraldo book lets you know that it is a literary book by using the exact same covers for every book, you are buying into the idea that this publisher knows how to publish the right kind of books, rather than looking to the book for itself, for the cover to speak for that specific book. You are instead handing your taste over to cultural gatekeepers. I can't do one video like this without shitting on Fitzcarraldo, but alongside that, we also have magazines. We have awards such as the Booker or the Pulitzer. We have critics who review specifically literary fiction books. There is an understanding in the literary world of what is literary fiction. The books that will be put forward for these awards are of a specific type, but it may seem on the surface that these writers have very little in common. What do Ishiguro, Cusk, Zadie Smith or McEwen have in common in the way of setting or themes or tropes or style? Very little. But what they do share is a sensibility. So as I think I've clearly laid out, when one tries to describe the genre of literary fiction, things can become a little hazy. And whilst it's true that all genres have boundaries that rub into one another, the centre of the thing tends to be clear. We know, for example, that Lord of the Rings is fantasy, and whilst there may be edges of the genre that blur into horror or science fiction or magical realism, that is where it is less black and white. We are still certain of what the centre of fantasy is. The problem with literary fiction is that even that centre is gooey. As Rachel Malik has argued, one of the difficulties raised by the category is the necessity for consistent endorsement by high-status cultural intermediaries whose judgment cannot be guaranteed or even predicted. While consumers of literary fiction typically seek the security of constant evaluation across a range of cultural authorities so as to orient their own readings. Like I said earlier about Fitzcarraldo editions putting on that iconic blue cover, because that means that is a brand of authenticity, a brand of quality assurance, to say this is literary fiction and you can read it as such. Similarly with the Booker Prize, and when books step outside of what we believe to be literary fiction, get that long listing accolade, we feel betrayed almost. As I said earlier, literary fiction is what you will know it when you see it, and in the culture that often means you will know it when the gatekeepers see it. And this also means that we are, as I have said, defining literary fiction against mass market fiction or genre fiction or popular fiction, all terms which more or less refer to the same thing. And as some have argued, that because it is not a term that exists discretely, it doesn't really exist at all. Ursula K. Le Guin said, "The distinction Mr. Rafferty makes between literary and genre fiction, though cherished by many critics and teachers, was never very useful and is by now worse than useless," which is damning censure indeed. Sean Thomas says, "I say good riddance to literary fiction. It was a silly, self-defeating genre in the first place, putting posh books in a posh ghetto, walling itself off from everyday readers. When I read a novel, what I really want is not beautiful sentences, but stories. Indeed, we all want story." This man has clearly never been on literary fiction booktube, because I can tell you there are people who do not want story out there, or at least who care for it very little. This defensiveness, this wish to deconstruct the idea of literary fiction altogether, comes from the snobbishness of a lot of the people trying to define it. But I know that literary fiction is what I want to read most of the time, because for me what I do enjoy is beautiful sentences. What I come to a book for is a playfulness with form, or a grappling with ideas through the written word. It is not necessarily for a plot, for an A to B. The best writers, of course, can do both, but if I'm prioritizing one thing over the other, it's the writing over the story. And these people who are arguing that it is just a marketing technique, just a way to say what book should be considered by Booker and Pulitzer readers, considered by people who consider themselves to be highbrow, which is a term with a complicated history related to eugenics, so I would personally not use it, but a lot of people do. They would say Ishiguro writes sci-fi, Colton Whitehead writes horror, Kate Atkinson writes mysteries. That's all there is to it. Will Norman, in his essay Killing the Crime Novel, said, "Literary fiction, to use Bourdieu's terminology, is a category of legitimate culture, in that it positions itself hierarchically within the cultural field in opposition to other categories, typically mass-market genre fiction. Literary fiction as a contemporary category dominating British and American literary culture since the 1980s does not necessarily share the rarefied forms of aesthetic composition and appreciation that Bordeaux located as essential for cultural capital. So Norman doesn't really like literary fiction, that's how it comes across in his essay, but he also says that it is purely a category of legitimate culture, this idea of what can be considered art versus what is media. And there are a lot of people who would even argue that literary fiction is middlebrow and doesn't quite reach the rarefied heights of Brechtian drama or opera, which are the actual legitimate culture. But I find this whole argument to be kind of boring. There is nothing inherently snobbish, inherently hierarchical about wanting to write a book using style, about wanting to write a book where the style is the point, where the ideas are being explored via the form, rather than through plot. So I don't always find myself agreeing with these people who argue it is purely a marketing term. And a lot of the literary world wants to differ as well. But when they do so, they seem to often prove the point of people who say it is pure snobbishness. Here are some of the most egregious quotes I found in my research. The typical genre writer keeps rhetorical flourishes to a minimum, and the typical reader is content to let them. Readers who require more must look either to other kinds of novels or to those genre writers who care deeply about their sentences. The formulaic nature of genre writers, variations serve to underscore such expectations, that keeps us coming back. Unlike genre fiction, which follows a loose but predictable narrative, literary fiction doesn't adhere to any rules. The pleasure that we derive from them, genre fiction novels, is the knowledge that we could be reading something better, something that, in the words of Arnold, reflects the best that has been thought and said in this world. That last one really is a piece of work. This argument suggests that the reason that literary fiction is a different genre is simply because it is superior to genre fiction, and that it is more complex, more interesting, better written, always and forever, immutably. But I have definitely read some terrible literary fiction and some good, well-written genre fiction. So I don't know if this distinction is as good, is as clear as these writers seem to say. Critic Arthur Crystal says, skilled genre writers know that a certain level of artificiality must prevail, lest the reason we turn to their books evaporate. It's plot we want and plenty of it. Heroes should go up against villains, sympathetic or hateful. Love should, if possible, win out. And a satisfying sense of closure and comeuppance should top off the experience. Basically, a guilty pleasure is a fix in the form of a story, a narrative cocktail that helps us temporarily forget the narratives of our own humdrum lives. And, for not a few readers, there's the additional kick of feeling that they're getting away with something. Instead of milking the cows or reading the Menno, they're dallying somewhere with 50 Shades of Grey. He is judging all genre fiction by the worst of its books, which I feel like would not go as well for literary fiction if it were to be judged by the same standards. And what I really find distasteful is the morality here. They're getting away with something. Guilty pleasures. This connection between genre fiction and alcohol that I think is just so puritanical. The morality of reading is something that I talk about in a video about empathy and reading, which I will leave linked in the cards above. And it is one that I find really tiresome. As a literary fiction reader, I read for pleasure. Yes, I get my pleasure from beautiful sentences, but that is simply an aesthetic thing. Taste is complicated and comes from a cultural connotation. We learn what taste is by the culture in which we live. And if we are brought up in a middlebrow household going to art galleries and the theatre, we're going to learn that literary fiction is good taste. It's not an innate thing. It is not a moral thing. It is a context thing. Not everyone who has that same upbringing will share that same experience, but that is the reason for its dominance in a certain sector of culture. And whilst it does take skill to write beautiful sentences, admiring that skill is no different or superior to admiring the skill of a well-built world in fantasy, or a well-constructed flirtation or yearning in a romance novel, a well-constructed twist in a thriller. I find it easier to escape in books that allow me to do a lot of the interpretation by myself, rather than playing out like a blockbuster film. I prefer less on-the-page clarity. But that is just another temperamental or aesthetic preference. It is not because I am eating my spinach. As Lev Grossman said, maybe it's the last vestiges of our Puritan heritage. If it's not hard work, it's sinful. Maybe it's just that we're self-loathing capitalists and anything associated with commerce, as genre fiction is automatically tainted and disqualified from having any literary aesthetic value. Not everyone has to read literary fiction, but anyone who can read literary fiction. And honestly, these literary fiction critics and writers are doing the genre no favour with their superiority and pretension. Lots of literary novels are dross. And Arthur Crystal, when he complains about genre fiction, saying, "Born to sell, these novels stick to the tried and true, relying on stock characters whose thoughts spool out in lifetime platitudes. There will be exceptions, as there are in every field, but for the most part, the standard genre or commercial novel isn't going to break the frozen sea inside us. Would be hard-pressed to have his frozen sea broken by much of the literary fiction market." And it's not a definition to say that literary fiction is what moves me personally and anything else is genre. And this kind of argument allows for bad arguments from the genre fiction side too. And claiming that genre fiction is primarily for entertainment, that it doesn't deliver memorable emotional experiences and doesn't contain the heart and soul of its writers. There are genre books that deeply engage with the issues we face in our world, that make readers cry and laugh, that stick with the audience for the rest of their lives. I don't think that what people are saying when they talk about literary fiction as grappling with ideas and the world in which we live is that genre fiction doesn't do this, just that is not the purpose or the point of genre fiction, and that making an audience laugh or cry doesn't mean you are writing a literary book or even a book that deals with topics of the world. Becoming so connected to characters or engaged in a plot that you are emotionally moved is not quite the same thing. And making a reader laugh or cry, while a skill, is not quite the same experience as literary fiction readers are describing. That is much more straightforward, rather than the complicated nuance of grappling with much smaller and less clear emotion. But there are some good arguments against the idea that literary fiction is just anything with more artistic merit than genre fiction. Writing of good genre fiction is not all uneven. It's not easy to find a sentence out of place in ton of French, or to find a work of literary fiction that sparks and snaps at you, like Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash. God knows there's plenty of bad writing in literary fiction too, but Crystal never talks about it. The badness tends to be of a different kind of badness. Slow, earnest, lugubrious prose, or too clever and self-conscious prose. But bad it is nonetheless. You wouldn't want to judge literary fiction on the basis of its mediocrities, so why judge genre fiction this way? As I said earlier, that was Lev Grossman again, and I think his arguments were probably the strongest against this literary fiction is just superior argument. Literary fiction is used as a qualitative description for high artistic merit. This is why some of the critics insultingly declare a work transcends genre to deserve the label, but it is simultaneously a label for a genre of work with varying quality. No one would say your average MFA grad novel is of high artistic merit, but they still tend to get the label literary fiction. This is true. There is a lot of literary fiction, as I have said, that is badly written. But I think the difference is in what it is attempting. Is it attempting to focus on style and form? Is it attempting to write beautiful sentences and to be focused on the construction or not? Is it attempting to write a plot? Is it attempting to follow a story? I think for me, those are two of the main differences. The idea being that genre fiction is driven by plot, the story is the thing, whereas for literary fiction, it is secondary, a means to an end, and not where our focus should be. Literary fiction ideas are exploring the psyche of their characters and grappling with the ideas within the framework of a plot, not telling a story that covers themes and a character's psyche. As Daniel Jose Older again said, Robert De Niro can do a lot of things, but he can't do sexy and he can't do funny, and he's managed to convince you that neither is important, which is kind of how some people are with plot. I think it can also be a signifier that we're in genre territory. Some literary fiction writers can't do plot, and they've managed to convince us that it's not necessary. But he does go on to say that a lot of modern literary fiction novels are tightly plotted. It is not necessary to be plotless in order to be literary. I was thinking of Another Brooklyn by Jacqueline Woodson, which is just one of the greatest literary novels of all time. And it's really a kind of murder mystery if you step back and look at it, but it's told in such a way that feels very literary. So that's the category that it goes in, but it's beautifully plotted out. So altogether, I have found it very difficult to come up with a clear and concise definition of what literary fiction actually is. The basic idea of romance is that it centres relationships and has a happily ever after. For a mystery, there has to have been a crime that has been committed, but that by the end of the novel is solved and we return to the status quo. Science fiction, we are in an imagined future wherein some element of science has altered, although we can also be a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, but it feels futuristic. But for literary fiction, everyone interested in the answer seems to have a different argument, even on the most basic of points. But some of the arguments we have discussed already hold more weight with me personally. Some people, for example, have argued that literary fiction is just a continuum of genre fiction. It's as if literary fiction is in the middle and then there's all the different genres, but some of them bleed towards literary fiction, or maybe it's at the top of a pyramid if we're being hierarchical again. But hybridization has been around for hundreds of years. Shakespeare did hybrids of genres, and I don't think that really blurs the line between genre and literary fiction. Lincoln Michel said, "This is how I like to think of genres, as different literary conversations, ones that stretch back in time and include not just authors, but critics, publishers, and readers. When a critical mass forms and the conversation is large enough, we have a genre." And that links back to what I was talking about before when I was talking about the modernists and history and the group of references to which literary fiction adheres. That clearly means that literary fiction is a genre because it is writing in a history. Literary fiction writers are referencing the same ideas, the same things, the same art movements, and that is cohering it into an actual genre, as opposed to something more ephemeral. When we read literary fiction, we can see the background and the history in the same way that science fiction writers or fantasy writers can. And in terms of the plot, I really like Alder's metaphor of the Duke Ellington albums, of piano in the background, or plot in the background. Plot happens in literary fiction novels, but it is not what they are for in the way that it is in genre fiction. So after all that, I think it seems clearest to me that the arguments I like the best are the arguments where we don't have a definition for literary fiction, but instead an analogy. Literary fiction is a conversation. Literary fiction is a jazz piano album. And for me, literary fiction is the subjunctive. The subjunctive is a slippery bit of grammar that, because it barely exists in English, can be quite hard for those of us who are native English speakers to understand. Is it a tense? Not really, but also sort of. It's a mood, the mood of possibility used in Romance languages for thoughts and hopes and dreams. It acts as a tense in some situations and not so much in others. And in English, it only exists in the construction "if I were to," the only time that you would correctly say in standard English, "I were." And this is how I see literary fiction. Is it a genre? Not really, but also sort of. It acts as a genre in some senses when discussing personal preference or lining up book prize long lists, but also it doesn't act like a genre when one tries to pin it down. It is sort of a genre, but it is definitely a sensibility. One in which form and style are foregrounded above plot and even above character. The characters are plumbed for their complexities, not for their relatability or connection to the reader. The ideas are more important than the plot, and no clear conclusions are drawn, no answers are given. No message is being sent. For me, literary fiction books are the ones that trust their readers to understand what they are saying without having to say it. And I'm sure there are examples of books that fulfill certain parameters of a particular genre that also fit with my definition of literary fiction. Wolf Hall, for example, is clearly historical fiction and also definitely literary. But it is also true that there are romance novels that fulfill the criteria of fantasy. There are science fiction books that fulfill the criteria of crime or mystery. Examples of hybrids are not proof of litfic's non-existence, but instead proof of the permeability of all genre boundaries. So hopefully you have gained an understanding of what literary fiction is, or at least how everyone is arguing about literary fiction in the world from this video. This is my first video essay where I didn't write a proper script, so please do let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Or your ideas about genre in the fiction world. Is literary fiction purely snobbery? Because some literary fiction readers clearly are snobs. And I would love to talk to you further. Thank you very much for watching. If you are new here, my name's Roshi, and I will see you again very soon. Bye bye.